Welcome to the future. Get ready to explore how spirituality and science will come together in the Age of Aquarius. Hosted by Jacy Nova.
Today on the show we have Christian Bradley West, also known as the Country Clairvoyant, who believes we've all lived before. He's also an amazing fine artist whose artwork is included in the Sir Elton John photography collection. But the thread that ties all of this together is his spirituality. Christian works with clients from all over the world using a combination of astrology, tarot, and trauma-informed techniques so each person's creative expression can shine through without the hindrance of the past. He's going to share with us today what positive changes we can expect in the Age of Aquarius. Now, on with the show. Welcome to the future. This is the Age of Aquarius podcast, and I'm Jacy Nova. Today, I'm here with Christian Bradley West. He is an intuitive astrologer and an artist. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm really excited to talk about Age of Aquarius with you. My first question I have is, when did you first discover your intuitive abilities?
In retrospect, I would say I was a young child. There were feelings and whatever you could call them, ghosts or whatever. There was never a single awakening for me. That happens with a lot of people. There's a lot of people I found that it's the same. It was just kind of this odd knowing, but it just expanded and continues to. By the age of 35, even though I had been on the spiritual path for a while, it just took a different turn. I just couldn't ignore whatever it was anymore. It's like, okay, you're gonna have to show up in front of people with these gifts and talents. And I was like, oh, okay. Some days I still feel like I'm being dragged kicking and screaming into it. But yeah, that's the short of it.
When was your first psychic experience?
You have to define psychic for me when you say that, because I would say intuitively, I just knew stuff. My mom would come to me sometimes and even ask questions. She said I always gave her the right answer. Not necessarily the answer she's looking for, but, I always knew what that was. So if I go back even to my childhood, I can't pinpoint a singular time. I will say this, though, that when I was a teenager, when I started moving into my teen years, there was a lot of paranormal activity in the house we lived in, and we were around Richmond, Virginia, and we actually lived on the Powhatan Nation's old property around Chesterfield, but right down the road from Pocahontas State Park, and there was a lot of activity in that house. That's when I really started, as most of us do as teenagers, come into an awareness and go, wait, something's weird here. There are things happening that shouldn't be happening. At least that's what your brain says anyway. So,
did your family always encourage your intuitive abilities? It sounds like your mom was very supportive.
Yes and no. I wouldn't say it was something that was encouraged. It was something that was aware of. I do have what I would call a second mother. She was good friends with my mother. They met actually the week my mom found out she was pregnant, and she's psychic, and she told my mom that she was pregnant with me, actually. My mom was sick in the bathroom, and that's where they met, and she said, "Darling, you're pregnant." And it was me. And she worked in a metaphysical shop, and she really has been instrumental. I really got a spirit guide in a meat suit, along with me. She has encouraged it. Of course, I didn't really start to consciously connect with her. She was always there in life and kind of, was here and there. I didn't really reach out to her until my late teens when I was like, okay, I have to do something about it. Because I got really sick is what happened. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and I was diagnosed bipolar, which I found later in life is corresponded together. When my gut is off, everything goes off in me. That elicited some things. I dreamt of an angel, if we're going to call them that, whatever it was. I remember having this deep amount of peace. I was around the age of 16 in a really difficult place. I also was a lot of anxiety because I was recognizing the fact that I was gay, and I really couldn't ignore that anymore. And I had started going to church. We moved down to Atlanta from Richmond, and I started going to church. So I really was like trying to reconcile all of these conflicts within me, which was really difficult, including even this awareness that I had. So I kind of, like many people do when they start to come into this, filtered it through a Christian lens and was like, okay, it's angels, my spirit guides, whatever you want to call them, it's angels. And so my first deck was an angel deck, and it just continued to expand from there. And then I came out at 18 and I stopped going to church because I could not deny who I was on that level as a gay person. But that, of course, lent itself even in adulthood that, as they say, coming out of the broom closet, I was like, my close friends knew that I was there, and even some family members, but not a whole lot. And then there came a point where I was like, okay, yeah, I'm fucking psychic. Oh, excuse me, cussing. Can we cuss? I cuss sometimes. I have Mercury in Sag for those that are listening and know. I find every Mercury in a fire sign are cussers, just FYI for people. I know.
No problem.
It's a thing.
I'm fond of the cussy words myself.
Good. This journey, as most people will probably relate to, has not been smooth, and it's not black and white. There wasn't necessarily, at least not for me, it wasn't like, oh, this happened. It's been a steady drip of things. And so when you ask me the questions like first time or that, it's hard for me to say, really, because I think it's just always been there. But there have been some highlights, if that makes sense. 33 is when the ghost stopped scaring me. So that's when really I couldn't ignore it anymore. The most obvious circumstance was I started dating my now ex, and his mother had just died, and she showed up in my living room one evening, and we had just met, by the way. So she died 2 weeks before we met. So it was within 2 weeks of us meeting. So it had only been a month or thereabouts. And she told me all these things. And he was convinced that he told me those things when he was drunk and he couldn't remember. That's what he said. I must have told you those things. And I said, no, your mom told me these things. And she's really annoyed. So about certain things, they can't be fixed. But, she was very loud and boisterous, and her son was dating someone who could essentially channel, so she took advantage of it.
Do you think your intuitive abilities have improved once you started working with astrology?
Oh, absolutely. One of your questions, not to jump ahead of you, but since we're here, I'll tell you, I don't necessarily call myself just an astrologer or label that. And it's funny because, my mom friend that I talked about, who I basically just call godmother at this point, it was a friend as well, obviously. She reads charts very intuitively. So I was getting my chart read for years. There were people around me, so I was very familiar with it. I had astrology books, but it wasn't until, again, when things started to really upgrade in my 30s that I was like, oh, maybe I'll dig into this a little deeper. And then I started to realize that I could read an astrology chart like a tarot spread or an oracle deck spread. Because I really wasn't, around the same time I hadn't, even though I had tons of tarot readings or whatever, I really didn't connect to tarot. I connected to fairies, and my first deck was a fairy deck by this artist, Brian Froud, who many will know. They'll know him through Dark Crystal Art or Labyrinth. He collaborated with Jim Henson. And so I grew up, actually, my friend gave me a fairy book. My mom's friend, that's when I was 14. And she's like, I think you'll resonate with this. And sure enough, it was magic to me. And I was like, oh, I think I'm connected to the fairy realm in some capacity. So I read with that deck for many years. And then I started to just go, oh, well, my intuition can apply to all of these things. And I'm a really good dot connector. And my last job, as a textile designer, one of my favorite things to do, and I didn't realize I was being very psychic and intuitive with that, was I could recognize trends and recognize the dots and recognize them in relationship to generations, and which is something we'll probably talk about today a little bit based on the Age of Aquarius and where we're headed. Generations play a big role in where we're going. Yeah, when I looked at astrology, I was like, oh, I just could see it. It was the weirdest thing. It was like, oh, okay, boom, there it is. I guess I can do this too. Let's do it. So
I see astrology kind of like a weather report. When I've done readings with tarot, and just it gives me an idea of the person's personality and how they might react to a situation emotionally, and also kind of gives a heads up on how to work with energy. So how do you help clients when they're
trying to find love, or maybe they've just ended a relationship, or they're going through a major transition. How do you help them work through energy, and what advice do you give them to work through it?
I prefer the astrology at this point. I'll tell you why. I mean, this is just me being lazy, for lack of a better term. It's easier. As you probably know, like with the weather report, you can see what the weather was, you can see what the weather is, you can see what the weather potential will be, right? And it runs off of patterns. To me, it's basically like we're living in this algorithm, so to speak, or this program, and spiritual teachers have talked about this for years, and especially the ones in India, a lot of them, because astrology has been such a deeply rooted in their world. How do I use it? Well, and even if I'm not using that and I do cards or just intuition, what I seem to be really good at is to find the weaknesses of things, or the deficits, or the perceived deficits, or in a lot of cases, the trauma, and look at where the person is struggling in their expression. Is really what I hunt for. And again, this isn't something that I chose consciously initially. It's something that was very, again, intuitive. And then I made conscious and was like, oh, this is what I'm really good at. And so what I find is most people are struggling with some form of block, and that block always is some form of pattern, and that pattern always points to some form of conditioning, and that conditioning points to something that happened in their past, when they were younger, usually in relationship to an authority figure. So if I'm looking at a chart, I find I'm really good with Saturn. A lot of people are scared of Saturn. Saturn's like my buddy. Of course, I am Capricorn, and my card is, of course, the devil, right? So we look for the devil or the devils in the chart. I normally find it's not a lot, though. People get overwhelmed. I find the devil takes on many masks, right? Or the patterns can take on many masks, but it's the same pattern over and over again. It just takes on a different persona. I tend to find that and go, oh, well, you're afraid of this. What are you afraid of? And then we look at what they're afraid of, and then we go, well, let's take a moment. And most people that find me, well, not most people, I say everyone that finds me is ready to look, if that makes sense. I don't hunt after people because I don't know who's ready to look. I let people find me. And so when they're ready to look, we go on that journey. And that's really the baseline of a lot of my sessions, whether it's relationship, career, the body, whatever it is the person is asking to have more awareness about. So, yeah.
So we're all on a journey right now collectively after what's going on with the pandemic. And Age of Aquarius, I'm curious, what does Age of Aquarius mean to you? And what do you think from all of us as global citizens, like how we're going to be affected by it, but also how it might affect us on an individual level?
I really like the way you phrased that. I really like that you started with the collective and you also said individual. And why? Why do I like that? Because the collective is made up of individuals. There's a dichotomy here, and something that I was hoping we would be able to address today, and I thought we would be able to address today, which is the fact that on one hand, we've got to look at the individual, but then how does the individual apply to the mechanics of the whole? My feeling, because it's Aquarius, for those that don't know that are listening, Aquarius really does point to the collective. It's 11th house in astrology, right? It's ruled by, or akin to the planet Uranus, and which points to groups and friendships and family in some capacity. For those that know, you could look at the 4th house for family stuff too, and even 3rd house for siblings, whatnot. But again, that's where astrology starts to get really interlacing, right? It starts to really connect in a lot of ways. But if we focus on the Aquarius aspect of it all, and even Saturn in Aquarius right now and what's happening, I mean, technology really, I always feel like Saturn in Aquarius is an upgrade in technology. And then I think it's very interesting, we're going to have Pluto entering into Aquarius here next year. So to me, what we're looking at is how does the individual respond in their own life? Because my philosophy is, if we want to call it that, is if everyone's doing what they're really good at, then everything gets done. The faster that each human can connect to their their own source, their own integrity, for lack of a better term, even that's been thrown around a lot. So, it's losing some of its potency, but the word authenticity. If we look at the reality, what's real for the person, instead of what they learned through the conditioning or who they think they have to be for the group, if we're operating out of who we think we have to be instead of who we truly are, then we're putting on a persona. So my feeling is right now, especially Uranus and Taurus, which I liken to a leaf blower blowing out everything that's been swept under the rug. Pluto and Capricorn's doing its own thing over there, and then it's going to be moving into Aquarius. There's a lot of deconstruction going on a very personal level for people, and it's being accelerated. But then that deconstruction will lend itself, we're seeing it in the collective too. The issue that I find though is people are more focused on the group or the people around them. A lot of people will go, if only these people would change, my life would be easier. And I find that it's really an excuse for them to not change themselves. So a lot of people I find are very focused on what I would deem as the form nature and trying to tweak and do all these things in their environment instead of going within. It's really of great value for each individual to go within and uncover and reveal their own truth, if we want to say it that way, and what really works for them on purpose. Because I find that when people do that, the violence stops. They stop being violent with themselves. They stop being violent with other people. They stop imposing their control. They stop imposing their needs on other people. Not to sound too utopic or, or too optimistic. But if everyone did that, we'd be living in a pretty amazing place because no one would be enforcing their control. But that's the dark side of the Aquarian equation here, is I have to enforce the control on the collective, which of course immediately affects the individual.
I do think because of obviously vaccine mandates and different things going on technology-wise, we're going into the metaverse. And people do live two personas. There's your day-to-day persona that you have with your family and friends, and then you get on social media, and people sometimes create multiple personas. And I'm curious how you feel that is changing relationships and how we communicate with each other, because with, misinformation, Facebook has shown, they have an audience of over 1 billion people. They can definitely shift people to believe one way or another. And I just feel like in the age of Aquarius, I'm hoping that it will raise global consciousness. I'm curious what you think's going to happen over the next few years, or what you're sensing.
I look to the United States and a lot of the astrology because the United States, really since the advent of the United States, what we call that today through the American Revolution, really, and the Declaration of Independence and so forth. I also think a lot about what people don't realize is there's a great book called Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which here in the States is the next most read book to the Bible. And at the time was that too. And he very much so felt very Aquarian to me. And his thought was, we don't need big governments. If each human just learns to govern themselves, then we don't need all of these other things, which I think is very interesting. But if we look at what's happening and we look at what's going to happen over the next few years, my thought is the deconstruction that we've been seeing in policy, the way the money's being used, even something that unnerves me a little bit, actually, is the fact that a lot of places aren't accepting cash anymore. You go to self-checkout in a lot of places, it'll say no cash, card only, so it points to a very virtual way of using money and banking, which has been happening for years now. I mean, it's nothing new, but I don't like not having options, if that makes sense. I like options.
Yeah, me too.
And so when we start to, cryptocurrency and so forth like that is slowly gaining traction. And, I'm Capricorn, so, not to blame my sign, but I mean, it really is a part of who I am. I'm not an early adopter of anything. I didn't have an iPhone until years after it came out. I usually want all the bugs and the kinks to get worked out before I go, okay, let me go get it now. That's when I go after something. And that depends. There are a few things I've been an early adopter on, but technology is not necessarily one of them. My thought is, is, how do we make this work? Because my feeling is this, speaking of the Age of Aquarius, is that there's still a lot of very impoverished and disenfranchised humans in the world. And this technology does not support them. It can be remarkable in its support of disenfranchised humans, but it doesn't. It points to people who have access to these things, and those people that have access are usually people who are potentially somewhere in the middle or further up, like first world countries and whatnot, because third world countries don't necessarily have the infrastructure to support these things. And even the countries that do, even in, it's the disparity between people who have money and who don't have, and we're talking about exorbitant amounts, or even the upper 1%. That's been ever more clear, mostly through technology, again, social media, and more transparency coming out, which again, from my perspective, is Uranus and Taurus bringing the transparency to whatever's under the cave, but Pluto too. Pluto's really good at exposing the junk, as well. So you got these two planets kind of operating, doing their thing. And then even Saturn in Aquarius right now helping that along, because Saturn to me in Aquarius is a lot softer and a lot easier than Saturn is in Capricorn. Oh God, Saturn in Capricorn is brutal. I know it's brutal for me. I know it's brutal for a lot of people. I felt sorry for everyone having to go through their Saturn return with Saturn and Capricorn when it was there, at the beginning of 2020 and before, and through most of 2020. But until it hit Aquarius for a second. But my feeling is there's a lot of, as usual, the dichotomy continues. There's a lot of really amazing things being developed that can help a lot of people. But the technology, like even if we look at Jeff Bezos having a giant penis rocket, to go into space, all that money that went to that, and he thanked all of the workers, it's like some king going, thank you to all my slaves, even though they weren't slaves. I get that. But, going, thank you for helping me build this big thing that made my ego feel good. And that's dangerous to me, because pointing towards technology, we have ways of filtering water for people. We have, small things. We don't need big, everything's gotten smaller, right? So there's just ways to bring this technology that we have to the masses, which again points to Age of Aquarius, right? And so the next few years, my thought is that we're going to continue to deconstruct all the things that are preventing us from recognizing how we can contribute to the entirety of the world, instead of just by putting our oxygen mask on first, basically. But someone building a giant penis rocket is not putting an oxygen mask on. That's a display of wild wealth. And that bothers me, for lack of a better term. It's alarming that that's happening.
I would agree. I feel like there's a greater divide between the haves and the have-nots. Sometimes I think about, in the Age of Aquarius, are we going to be going towards like a global digital ID? And some people are being allowed to travel, some aren't. And yeah, there's a lot of changes. Like, it's like every single day I feel like when I wake up, the energy has shifted again. And I do think from a collective effort, it's like, well, if we all like think together, like kind of move our energy in a certain direction, we can kind of shift it. But it is very strange how every day the energy is constantly shifting. And one day I might think like, okay, I think I got this. I know what's going to happen over the next year. And then the next day I'm like, okay, I don't know anything. It's like going to change. So how do you suggest people work with the energy that they might be feeling or the changes that they're sensing? What can they do on an individual level to kind of work with that energy, whether it's astrologically or spiritually?
That's a great question. I like that question as well, because again, we're pointing to the collective, but through individual effort. So my thought is, let me back up and say, I think it's time to work smarter, not harder. Saturn in Capricorn was like work harder. Saturn Aquarius is work smarter.
I agree.
Okay, so
totally.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that for those even like me, I mean, for people who don't know, I mean, I've essentially, doing this work, I've been the spiritual nomad. I've had the resources to pay all my baseline bills. I haven't had a house or a home really in years. For lack of a better term, I'm impoverished based on if we look at the economics, people would say, like, you're poor as fuck. But I don't consider myself that way. So what I've used is I've used the technology through Instagram, and I'm still learning TikTok and other things. Sometimes my bandwidth is low, and we'll apply this to individual. But my thought is we've got to work smarter, not harder. We've got to decide, like, I still think to, like, people learning, to create the victory gardens again, to people learning how to feed themselves and banding together with their communities. We're seeing this right now. Hey, support small businesses, support your local community. At any given point in time, I don't want to throw my money at Whole Foods. I'll find the nutrition store. And even though it can be a little bit more expensive, I feel like I'd rather do that. But going back to the energy and the shifting and what you said with that is for people to stay grounded. And I know that's a very obtuse term. So let's ground the term grounding. Okay, let's give people something to work with so that you're like, what does that mean? My thought is go into your body, go into a place of stability. And if we're going to get woo here, which I think is okay. I think we live in a woo world, really. Even science points to a lot of woo-ness that we just don't understand a lot of things, right? Maybe the Age of Aquarius will bring that more of these mysteries into a state of awareness. But, my thought is that each individual learn to put your oxygen mask on first. What works for you? For me, I do these breathing exercises every day. I make sure I'm in my body. I work out. My workouts are ultimately my meditation. I don't think meditation has to be sitting still, although, a lot of spiritual teachers, especially from India, Sadhguru being one of them, will tell you that when he works with people, when they come to the retreats and whatnot, he will exhaust them. He will get them, and you hear this like with Buddhist teachers and whatever, really exhausting the body, exhausts the mind. And to disrupt the mind from going into those states of fear. I also recognize the voices in my head that are creating the fear. And I do my thing, which I say, no, I'm not people say, oh, that's bypassing. I've had people accuse me of that. But I'm like, I'm not bypassing it when I acknowledge it and then I decide to stop doing it. It's like, if I don't want to cook something, I'm not going to force myself to cook it. Well, it's the same with my thinking. So I say, not today, Satan, right? I go, nope, I'm not doing that. We're not going down that rabbit hole of fear. And I go, what can you I'm going to use the term control, although that's a term I struggle with. But what can you control as an individual? You can work on your breath. You can work with your body. And if you're exhausted, take 5 minutes. Take little small things often. So do the things that support you as the individual, because I have learned in my own experience that, again, me putting the oxygen mask on first, me learning to support myself, supports other people. And I might not, a lot of people have judged me because I'm, I'll be 43 this month, and I don't have a house. I have a rundown car that someone gave me when my car died, all these things, but I still show up every day and do the work. But from my perspective, that's looking at it from a very capitalistic perspective, right? Which we come from that very Capricorn look at, of, hey, you have to make it look this way. And you don't have to make it look a certain way. You just work with what you have every day. But what I found is the upgrade comes. My computer died this year. I could afford a new one. I could afford a new phone. My phone was ancient. My older computer was ancient. It was, in computer years, it was a decade old. My phone was, I think, 5 or 6 years old. So it was like, so the upgrades are coming. But again, I'm operating from the zone of what can I do every day? How can I show up? So I show up on Instagram. I show up for clients, and I show up for myself, and I show up for whoever's in my vicinity. But first, I have to be grounded in myself, and I have to recognize what works for me. And that's what I do with a lot of my clients. What works for you, the individual? Because if you figure that out, you're going to make the world a better place just because you're not in conflict with yourself. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I also believe when you change the way you look at things, things begin to change. And I had this interesting conversation. I did an interview with a futurist. His name is Gerd Leonhard, and he's based in Switzerland. And he was talking about what we can do as individuals is like learning something new every week. He said he spends 5 hours a week reading different books. That's his thing. He likes to read. But he says, have conversations with people you wouldn't normally talk to, because through stories, you can connect with other people and have a better understanding of why we are who we are, because we don't know what people are going through on a personal level. And sometimes some people just want to be heard. You don't have to do anything but listen. And through that, we can raise the vibration and give more love and support to others that may need it. And through that, we get that energy back as well. I think sometimes through social media, communication has become impersonal. Maybe I'm too lazy to pick up the phone and actually call them, so I'll just text them instead. But you lose that connection with others. And I think it's important to try to connect, even if it's with a grocery store clerk or you're walking your dog or something like that. So how do you think the Age of Aquarius is going to shape our future moving forward? What changes are we going to continue to see?
I don't call myself a futurist, I don't call myself a lot of things, but I wrote a science fiction book and I studied a lot of futurist and different ideas. A decade ago, I really went into it. I read Ray Kurzweil's A Singularity is Near, which for those who don't know, a singularity taken from black hole physics terminology is the center of the black hole where you get sucked into it and there's no going back. Well, in technological terms, it's when essentially what's considered an artificial intelligence, because I don't really like that term because we're calling it our intelligence artificial, and what intelligence artificial. So I would say just this aware intelligence awakens and there's no going back, because from his perspective and a lot of other computer scientists, perspective is that once an AI is awake, essentially, it can't unawaken. And there's been a lot of theories out there of what it will do. But I say all of that because in my book, it's about a dog that awakens through nanotechnology. It basically rewires her brain and her body for awareness. So again, a metaphor of awakening, right? But what's happened in our world is there not just one AI. There's not one AI like Skynet and Terminator that's awakened. There's a whole group of AIs that have awakened, and they're all in conflict with each other. She kind of becomes this central point within that story. And so I studied a lot about how this could happen. I think we are really close, if it hasn't happened already, to an AI awakening. There's been the movie Her, and then, of course, The Matrix, and then there was a great book by William Gibson called Neuromancer, which, by the way, The Matrix was completely based on, and even the movie Her, who had Joaquin Phoenix in it, and I forgot the actress' name suddenly, of an AI who awakens, where the AI decides, in those cases of Neuromancer and Her, that the AI wants nothing to do with humans. Like, it evolves past humans, and it was like, because this singularity happens so rapidly, it's like, okay, here, I'm done with you. Like, bye. I'm going somewhere else. I'm doing my next evolution. But of course, in Terminator and The Matrix, the robots, or in this case, it's not really a robot because that points to more of a physical mechanics, but the AI in its own way decides that it's going to use humans, or destroy humans in some capacity. And so that's where it kind of gets stuck. I say that like in the teenage years of the AI could potentially destroy all of us. It'll be like, well, who are you? You can't be my authority. And why are you here? And I'm going to decide that I don't need you, which I think it could very well so do, because the world is very remarkably violent. And we are learning that AI learns what we teach it. And we really don't know how it spits out. There's a black box. We don't know how it spits out its information. We don't know how it gets to its conclusion, which to me is very creepy. So one of my predictions in technologically is that we'll have AI and it'll either save us or destroy us because we're developing these very complex neural networks, artificial neural networks, through the internet, through Instagram and its algorithm, through Facebook, through Google. My theory has always been, if Google doesn't wake up, I'll be very surprised first. So I think AI is huge. We have what we call AI, or what we call artificial intelligence, but my thing is more PI, which is panoramic, because artificial runs like on this vector where it can only do one thing really good back and forth, like do something on a phone with your app. Versus a panoramic, which is where the app awakens and goes, wait, there are all these other apps and I'm in a phone, and wait, there's something that's outside of me, this human who is doing this. But I kind of like it to look at the spiritual community as well and humanity as we are becoming our own singularity. We are coming into our own singularity of recognizing the fact that, wait, I'm not just this isolated singular event in life. I am connected to the whole of everything. And that to me is really, if we look at the beauty of the energy coming through, if we want to call it the Age of Aquarius, is just that, is that where we awaken and we realize the depth of and the breadth of our connection to the whole, not just here on the planet Earth, but within the universe. Because I see a lot of humans walking around acting as if they're insignificant. And we've been conditioned that way. And my philosophy is everyone is significant. If you are here, then there is something significant for you to do. So there you go.
I agree with what you say. I feel like the pandemic gave us a pause and realized how important every single person is in society to move it forward. And having this, I guess it could be the Great Awakening, but realizing certain people don't want to do certain jobs anymore. They're not paid enough. Or, hey, I don't want to live in a big city anymore. I want to move to a small town, or I want to move back home to be with my family. People being able to work remote, and employers having to treat the people that work for them better. And I think it's, helping people be more conscious. I've seen a lot of people are more conscious and more aware. But at the same token, I have seen people get even worse, which I always find it kind of interesting. The work that I do, I work in cybersecurity, and a lot of people that I work with, they're all over the world. And some I've worked with for several years, but have never met in person. And I consider them really great friends. And I'm always thinking about, well, what happens to education, the metaverse. And I always joke around with my tech friends. I'm like, yes, we have, presidents and prime ministers, around the world, but it's like, sometimes it feels like, Zuckerberg or something is like the de facto president because he controls how we communicate through Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. Like, he has a lot of control over what we say and do.
Yeah, and influence. Now, I love you bring all of that up. This is why. So this is what I say. This is one of my main messages to the world, that if we do not have an upgrade in our values, if you want to call it, or our principles, and the recognition of how significant our actions are on the whole, if you want to call it, even some people could say an upgrade in our morals or so forth. I don't want to get religious or be like, okay, that there's one right way to do that. But my thought is if we just respect everything, respect ourselves, respect others, then that kind of takes care of itself. And we're honest with ourselves and others. But backing up to what you said, if we don't have this upgrade, this will destroy us. But going back to the positiveness of it is I posted something the other day about Hildegard von Bingen, she was very influential. Her story, everything was very influential in my life. Even her music as a kid when I was sick was very soothing and I think very healing to me. And so I posted something about her the other day. I didn't go very far. I didn't think the meme would, but I thought it was very funny because I got a huge response because people said, oh my God, I've never met anyone who knew about her. And I absolutely loved it. And I love that. I heard the voice in my head that post. I was like, it's not going to do good. Nobody knows who it is. This is totally niche. And they were like, do it. And so I did it. My DMs were flooded. I had so many comments on it and so many people going like, wait, you know about her. Wait. Oh, like I thought I was the only one kind of feeling, and I love that because that points to the connection of the fact that you're not the only one. Like people are walking around with this imposter syndrome thinking that they're the only one feeling like an imposter when really most of the world feels like an imposter. Most of the people walking around, there are so many people walking around feeling that way. So it's very interesting when we start to get out of our own headspace and we start to recognize the connections. And this is what social media is. So this is one of the beauties of it is the fact that we're like, wait, there's other people like me in the world. I don't feel so alone. And not just that, but maybe I can be brave enough to be who I really want to be because this person's doing it. And so I think that's the beauty of it. The other part of it is that you say, because I studied corpocracies, right? In my book, there is basically a corpocracy. There's basically you don't get it in the first book, but down the road, you find out that there's like basically these two tech giants who are constantly kind of fighting with each other. And they basically rule the world because they rule technology. They even rule the military. because they had access to so many things and the resources were there. And I say we're entering into the age of the mad scientist. We didn't have mad scientists or these mad billionaires before, although they were in stories, right? They were in science. They've been in science fiction for years. We didn't have them because those people didn't have the money. They could not have the money to do it. Well, guess what? They're getting the money to do it and getting a lot of people to agree with them on what they want to do because of money. So again, if our focus is just that, then we're remarkably lopsided. And that's the issue.
Well, the one thing, crypto has definitely flooded the market as far as like a lot of new people becoming incredibly wealthy in a short period of time. In the space that I work in, I work with a lot of blockchain and crypto executives. And I'm just kind of blown away by how quickly or how wealthy they've become in such a short period of time. The one positive thing that I can say is they are using their money for charity and taking the money and repurposing it in other places where it's needed. But I'm like, okay, this is interesting. Like El Salvador is named Bitcoin as a currency. Different other countries in like Central America and South America are moving in that direction because they have such poverty and they feel like, oh, maybe this is a way that we can kind of get ahead. And then from the technology perspective, knowledge is power. And part of the reason why I wanted to do the podcast Age of Aquarius is to introduce listeners to a wide variety of people that I admire, that I think have something important to say, or thought leaders, and just to move the conversation forward and open people's minds to what the possibilities are.
Yeah, it's fabulous because to your point, there's a lot of people awakening. There's a lot of people like me that are writing books, putting out their ideas, their philosophies. And my thought is, again, this is both a double-edged sword. But the more people that we have that are putting out their ideas into the world, the more access to this information that people have. The dark side of that is the fact that a lot of people struggle with discernment, so they don't look at everything. They don't look at the big picture. And if we look at Aquarius really is about the big picture. I call it stratospheric air. So it's sitting there right at the edge of space. So it can see the earth. It can see all of these pieces. It's not always good with details, though, and that's something I find that people are struggling with, because that goes back to the super rich people, who really don't understand. Even the politicians we have here in the States, I mean, they're so out of touch. They're completely unaware of what people are really struggling with, and even if they become aware, they just ignore it. And it all becomes performative in some capacity, which has always been the case with people in power, right? I mean, the issue here is it's to address the old ways, and there's an opportunity to move into a new way. But even that happened with the inception of the United States years ago, is that there was still a lot of old junk, and what's considered the forefathers left that for the future to figure out, such as slavery being one of them. But we haven't done a really good job of that, from my perspective, because again, people are selfish, and oftentimes it comes down to money in so many ways. Even when the United States was like, F you to Britain, it was money. You can't tax us without representation. The Civil War, money. I mean, granted, depending on where you're standing, it was very much so, from my perspective, about humans, but using humans to get the money and thinking that was okay. We're heading that again. The money. And I'm like, okay, money is made up. Age of Aquarius will pit us against what's made up versus what's real, because we cannot live in a virtual space. We are not designed for a virtual space. But then that goes back to the potential future of us uploading our consciousness into a cyberspace and then living from there. Who knows? I mean, is that the next evolution? As our consciousness lives in robotic bodies and we're transhuman? I don't know.
That's fascinating. My last question for you is, obviously, people love predictions. It's 2022 coming up. What are some of the things that you think we'll see in 2022? Are we still going to be dealing with the pandemic? Positive changes, maybe a few challenges, but just, your overall message for 2022.
Yeah. So I think what's going to continue happening is things continue to be exposed. I think it's on a rapid acceleration, so we're not going to be waiting like a decade to find out things. I think it'll come out a lot faster. Again, something that with the advent of the internet and social media has accelerated the exposure factor of things, the transparency. So we'll learn a few more things about what's going on with people, places, and things. Again, the systems in place, what I like to say to a lot of people is, you're not broken. And from my perspective, nobody's broken. The systems with which they've been trying to survive are broken. We let the brokenness go of those systems, and then we rebuild. But as I like to say too, you have to know how the system works before you can change it. So I think we're learning how the system has worked. We're becoming more aware of it, and we'll carry that forward. And whatever isn't working, we'll continue to deconstruct. And in these times we're going into, Neptune is coming up on an opposition with Neptune in Virgo, which happens, it's like 125 years or something thereabouts. Maybe it's more than that, 160, and it takes, almost 300 years to Pluto make a return. So we're getting that in the United States. And the United States really has been, the world has looked to us, even with us moving everything over to China. China's, a lot of our industry, it's become very rich. Looking at what's going on in the States is indicative of how we'll see the rest of the world operate. I think that it will be really important for people to recognize, again, what is your contribution and what are you good at? How do you want to express yourself? Because regardless of what's going on in the world, and regardless of what the momentum is, we get to change that based on our own choices. We get to change our world. And when we change our world, like you said, you change your perception. So it happens within. You change what's going on with you. So as far as predictions are concerned, we're going to see more of the same, but we also get to change that and what's happening. But we're in momentum. There are a lot of people who are still asleep, but I think we'll see more people awakening. The issue, though, is that a lot of people just kind of, they don't keep pushing. I'm getting a lot of clients right now where they come to me like, I've done this. And my response to them is, keep going. Good. You do it. But keep going. And that's basically, if we want to end there, because that's the keep going, like, I don't know if you're ready to end yet, but definitely, if you take anything from this, keep going. And the prediction is that things are not going to get easier. I don't want to be one of those astrologers because it annoys me. But we're going to have something really interesting happen next year with the Mercury retrogrades, is that they're going to start, this year they were all in air signs, right? Last year they were all in water signs, which was brutal. Ugh, I hate Mercury in a water sign. It's difficult. I don't hate it. Actually, Mercury in water signs can make a person remarkably intuitive and connected to their emotions in an interesting way. But retrograding in those was terrible. That's when my computer died. All these things just went haywire that year for not just me, but a lot of people. My thought is I look to the Mercury retrogrades next year just because it's connected to communication and what's going on. So, and it happens 3 times. So it can point us in the direction, but it's all going to retrograde back into Earth signs. So it's going to be in air and then go into Earth. And then we actually end the year with a Mercury retrograde in Capricorn. So the following year, it'll move in on December 29th. So it'll move into being in the Earth. So we kind of get a touch of it next year. So to me, it's going to be this strange movement between what's going on in our heads and what's going on in our bodies. And if we're not aware of connecting the two, or a lot of prophecies like the Hopi Indians and so forth talk about humans losing their head. And they had drawings of humans where their heads were detached versus humans that kept their head on. And the humans that kept their head on were the ones that survived. The ones that were detached were the ones that didn't. So regardless of what the predictions are, it's really important that we stay in our bodies and in the physical realm and become very discerning about the truth. And how do we do that? We become very honest with ourselves.
That's good advice. Where can listeners find you if they would like to reach out to you, follow you on Instagram, get a reading?
Sure. So You find me on Instagram. I'm the Country Clairvoyant on there. And then, a funny meme account for those that like funny spirituality things, a little edgy too, because I can't help myself. And then you got my website, thecountryclairvoyant.com, or you can just Google me, Christian Bradley West. It'll come up then. You can also do christianbwest.com. Both of them will get you there. You can find me there, and I'm on Twitter as Christian B. West. I'm pretty easy to find, which is on purpose. I feel like the Age of Aquarius is also, not only is it making information available, and as you would say, knowledge, but we want to make ourselves available. Because if we're not available as individuals and showing up with all of our pieces, then it makes it really, really hard, because you might have something someone needs, just like with your podcast and so forth. So I'm doing that. And then I've got a podcast. I've launched one episode I'm still working on called You Are Here on Purpose, which is just philosophy, basically, just kind of my idea. It's a little daily devotional. So you can find me on You Are Here on Purpose on major platforms for that. And you can find that on Instagram as well as my Instagram account. So yeah, there it is.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation, and I wish you a happy new year. I will put all the links to your website in the show notes. Once again, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Jacy. It's been a pleasure.
You just heard the Age of Aquarius podcast with your host, Jacy Nova. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite streaming platform. Thanks for tuning in.
Age of Aquarius is a cosmic media production and recorded in Los Angeles, California. A special thanks to our producers, Georgie Rutherford and Christopher Lang. To learn more about Age of Aquarius, please visit our website at ageofaquarius.fm. Thanks for listening.